You're standing on the walls of Rome. The year is 452 AD, and the greatest city in the world is holding its breath. No army defends the gates. No legions march to meet the threat. The Senate has fled. The emperor has abandoned his throne. And somewhere beyond the northern horizon, moving closer with every hour, is a man who has already destroyed 70 cities. A man who doesn't just conquer, he erases. You've heard the stories from survivors who staggered south with wild eyes and trembling hands. Stories about warriors whose skulls look alien, deliberately deformed since birth. About a warlord who eats from wooden plates while his enemy's gold melts in the fires of their burning cities. About entire populations vanishing as if they never existed. The city that stood here yesterday is just empty ground today, and even the wind seems afraid to blow across it. His name is whispered in churches as if speaking it too loudly might summon him. Attila the Hun, Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God, and he's 3 days away from your gates. Before we step into the darkness of what's coming, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching this from. It never stops amazing me that a story from 15 centuries ago can reach people in every corner of the planet. All of us trying to understand the same question. How does one human being become the living embodiment of apocalypse? This is the story of how a name became synonymous with the end of the world. How a man with no grand monuments, no surviving palaces, and no written laws carved his legacy so deeply into history that we still invoke his name when we want to describe pure, unstoppable destruction. But here's what the legends usually miss. Attila wasn't a mindless destroyer. He was a psychological genius who understood something terrifying about human nature. That fear, properly weaponized, is more powerful than any army. That reputation can accomplish what swords alone never could. That sometimes the threat of violence is more devastating than violence itself. And the truly disturbing part, he was right. To understand Attila, you first have to understand the world that created him. A world the Romans couldn't comprehend and, frankly, didn't want to. The year is 406 AD on maps. The Roman Empire still looks magnificent, vast territories stretching from Britain to the Black Sea, from the Rhine to the sands of North Africa. But maps lie. Behind the marble facades and proclamations of eternal glory, the empire is hemorrhaging. Germanic tribes are pouring across the frozen Rhine. The economy is collapsing under the weight of military spending and corruption. The borders, once ironclad certainties, have become porous suggestions. And somewhere far to the east, beyond the edges of Roman knowledge, beyond what they considered the civilized world, something is stirring. The Huns? Roman historians wrote about them with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, describing them as barely human. These weren't people who lived in cities or farmed land. They were perpetual nomads, born on horseback, living on horseback, dying on horseback. They practiced cranial deformation, binding infant skulls with tight bands, forcing the bones to grow into elongated, cone-like shapes. Imagine seeing an army of warriors cresting a hill, all with skulls that look alien, inhuman, like they came from somewhere beyond the stars. This wasn't just aesthetic. This was psychological warfare before a single blow was struck. They lived on horseback to such an extreme degree that Roman writers claimed they couldn't even walk properly. They ate, slept, and conducted diplomacy while mounted. They would place raw meat under their saddles and ride all day, the pressure and heat from the horse tenderizing it. By nightfall, they'd eat it raw, still warm from the animal's body. They were masters of the composite bow, a weapon that could pierce Roman armor at distances the legions had never encountered. Their tactics were revolutionary. They didn't line up for honorable combat. They swarmed, surrounded, feinted retreats to draw enemies into ambushes, and disappeared like smoke when threatened. To Romans who valued order, structure, and the proud traditions of civilized warfare, the Huns represented chaos incarnate, the nightmare made flesh. Into this world, around 406 AD, Attila was born. Now here's what the legends usually gloss over. Attila's path to absolute power began with murder. In 434 AD, when the previous Hunnic leader died, power was divided between two brothers Attila and Bleda. For over a decade, they ruled together, launching coordinated campaigns against the Eastern Roman Empire, extracting massive tributes of gold. The arrangement worked in its way. But Attila didn't just want power. He wanted something far more intoxicating. Absolute, unquestioned dominance. He wanted people to think of the Huns and see only one face. His face. Around 445 AD, Bleda died under what historians delicately call mysterious circumstances. No battle wounds are mentioned in any chronicle. No illness, no accident, just ... gone. Most scholars agree on what really happened. Attila killed his own brother. Think about the cold calculation required for that decision. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a man looking at his own blood relative, someone he'd ruled alongside for over a decade, and deciding he was an obstacle that needed to be removed. Did Attila poison him? Have him quietly strangled? Stage a hunting accident? We'll never know. And that's exactly the point. Delay made sure we'd never know. What we do know is what happened next. With Bleda gone, Attila transformed the Hunnic Confederation into something far more terrifying. He unified the scattered tribes under one iron will, his will. In 448 AD, a Roman historian named Priscus visited Attila's court on a diplomatic mission. What he witnessed and recorded gives us one of the most revealing psychological portraits in history. At a grand banquet, Attila's guests, kings, chieftains, Roman ambassadors ate from silver and gold plates. They drank from jeweled goblets. They wore their finest clothes, dripping with the wealth of conquest. And Attila, he sat at the head of the table, eating plain meat from a wooden plate, drinking from a wooden cup, wearing simple, clean clothes with no ornamentation whatsoever. Priscus noted something else. While everyone around him laughed and celebrated, Attila's expression never changed. He didn't smile. He didn't make small talk. He just watched. This wasn't humility. This was dominance. Attila was showing everyone in that room that while they needed gold and silver and jewels to feel important, he didn't need anything. He was beyond such petty desires. He was the center of gravity around which everything else orbited. It's one of the most chilling power moves in history, and it worked perfectly. People who met Attila describe feeling physically intimidated by a man who, by all accounts, was relatively short and unremarkable looking. He had a broad chest, a large head, small eyes, a thin beard. Nothing about his physical appearance was particularly imposing. But those eyes, everyone who met him mentioned the eyes. Priscus wrote that Attila could control people with a single look, that he had a way of staring at someone that made them feel naked, as if he could see every secret they'd ever kept, every lie they'd ever told, every moment of weakness they'd ever experienced. That kind of presence doesn't come from physical strength. It comes from something far more unsettling, the absolute certainty that you're capable of anything, and everyone around you knows it. Attila's first major target was the Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople. The Romans had a system: pay tribute to the barbarians, keep them happy, avoid war. It was expensive, humiliating even, but it was cheaper than fighting. So they paid the Huns enormous amounts of gold, thousands of pounds of each, just to stay away. But in 441 AD, the Eastern Empire made a catastrophic mistake. They missed a payment. Attila didn't send a letter of complaint. He didn't open negotiations or request a meeting. He unleashed hell. His army swept into the Balkans like a plague. But here's what made Attila different from other barbarian raiders. This wasn't about loot. This was about sending a message. The city of Naissus was one of the first to fall. When Attila's forces breached the walls, he gave an order that would become his signature: total annihilation. Not just military targets, everything. Contemporary accounts describe what happened next, and they're almost too horrific to believe. The Huns methodically killed every living thing in the city. Men, women, children, livestock. Buildings were burned, wells were poisoned. The city was left as a monument to what happened when you crossed Attila. But here's the truly disturbing part. Years later, when Roman ambassadors passed through the area where Naissus once stood, they reported that they couldn't even approach the ruins. The stench of death was so overwhelming that the entire area remained uninhabitable. They found the banks of the nearby river still covered with bones. Years later, the stench of death at Naissus still made the area unapproachable. And Naissus wasn't alone. Over 70 cities met the same fate. Serdica, Philippopolis, Archidiapolis, all systematically erased. The Eastern Empire had no choice but to negotiate. The 443 AD treaty was humiliating. The annual tribute tripled. A demilitarized zone established south of the Danube. Escaped Romans in Hunnic territory returned or paid for, while Hunnic defectors to Rome could stay freely. The empire that once dictated terms to the world now bent to nomadic horsemen. Many Christians saw this destruction as divine punishment. They called Attila Flagellamde, the Scourge of God. Attila embraced the title. If people believed he was God's instrument, fear would break their will. It was perfect psychological warfare. By 450 AD, the Eastern Empire was drained. Attila turned west, seizing on an absurd pretext. Princess Justa Grata Honoria, desperate to escape an arranged marriage, sent him her ring and a plea for help. Attila claimed it was a marriage proposal and demanded half the Western Empire as her dowry. In 451 AD, he invaded Gaul with his largest army. Cities burned, Metz, Reims, Strasbourg. And then, against all odds, Roman general Aetius forged an alliance with the Visigoths to stop him. They met Attila's forces at the Catalonian plains in June 451 AD. The battle that followed was one of the bloodiest in ancient history. Ancient sources claim anywhere from 165,000 to 300,000 casualties, though modern historians think these numbers are exaggerated. But even conservative estimates put the death toll at over 50,000 in a single day. This wasn't like modern warfare with clear lines and objectives. This was a churning, chaotic mass of bodiesmen hacking at each other with swords and axes, horses trampling the wounded, blood turning the earth to mud. The Visigothic king Theodoric I was killed in the fighting, his body later found trampled under the hooves of horses. As night fell, both sides were exhausted, bloodied, and horrified by what they'd done to each other. Attila withdrew his forces to his camp and prepared for a last stand. According to legend, he had a funeral pyre built from horse saddles, planning to throw himself on it rather than be captured if the Romans breached his defenses. But the attack never came. Aetius, for reasons historians still debate, didn't press the advantage. The result was technically a draw, but strategically it was a defeat for Attila. His aura of invincibility was broken. For the first time in his career, he'd been forced to retreat. But if the Romans thought this meant Attila was finished, they were catastrophically wrong. A wounded animal is the most dangerous animal. And Attila was wounded not in body, but in pride. In 452 AD, he invaded Italy. And this campaign was personal. Aquileia was the first major target, one of the wealthiest and most fortified cities in the empire. The siege lasted 3 months, and the city's defenders were confident they could hold out indefinitely. Then one day, Attila was observing the walls when he noticed storks abandoning their nests on the city's towers, flying away with their young. To Attila, this was an omen. Even the birds knew what was coming. He ordered one final massive assault. The walls were breached. And then Attila gave the order that would define this campaign: erase it. What happened next wasn't a sacking, it was a deletion. The Huns killed systematically. Men were butchered. Women and children were enslaved or murdered. Buildings were demolished stone by stone. The wealth of the city was taken. Everything else was destroyed. When they were done, Aquileia didn't exist not as ruins, not as a ghost town. It was gone. For centuries afterward, travelers passing through the area couldn't even tell a city had once stood there. The survivors fled into the marshes and lagoons of the Adriatic coast. They waded into the water, carrying what little they could save, and began building a new settlement on the islands. They drove wooden piles into the muddy bottom and built their homes on platforms above the water. Figuring horsemen couldn't follow them there, they were right. That settlement would eventually become Venice, one of the world's most beautiful cities, born from absolute terror. Think about that. An entire civilization was built on stilts in a swamp because people were so terrified of one man that they chose to live in water rather than risk encountering him again. Attila's army swept through northern Italy like a scythe. Padua fell, Verona fell, Milan fell. Each city brought more loot, more slaves, more terror. The Roman Emperor Valentinian III fled from Ravenna to Rome. The Senate met in emergency session, and they realized something horrifying. Rome had no army capable of stopping Attila. The city was completely defenseless. The city began to panic. Rich families packed their valuables and fled south. Temples filled with people praying for divine intervention. The streets buzzed with rumors. Attila would burn the city to the ground, enslave everyone, turn Rome into another Aquileia blank spot on the map. And then something strange happened. With no army to defend Rome, the Senate made a desperate decision. They didn't send a general or a politician. They sent Pope Leo I. The two men met near the Mincio River in northern Italy, an elderly bishop in simple robes facing the Scourge of God. Nobody knows exactly what was said. The meeting wasn't recorded. No transcript exists. But somehow, impossibly, Leo convinced Attila to turn around and leave Italy. Christian legend has a dramatic explanation. As Leo spoke, Saints Peter and Paul appeared in the sky behind him, holding flaming swords, threatening Attila with divine punishment. Terrified by this heavenly vision, Attila retreated. It's a beautiful story, but historians have other theories. By the time Attila reached Leo, his army was in trouble. Italy had suffered a poor harvest. Food was scarce. Disease was spreading through the Hunnic camps, probably malaria from the Italian marshes. Soldiers were dying not from Roman weapons, but from starvation and fever. On top of that, Attila had received word that the Eastern Roman Emperor had launched a counterattack across the Danube, striking at Hunnic territory while Attila was distracted in Italy. Maybe Leo didn't perform a miracle. Maybe he delivered strategic intelligence along with a promise. Leave now and Rome will pay you a massive sum of gold. Stay and watch your army disintegrate while your homeland burns. Or maybe, and this is the disturbing possibility, maybe Attila was playing a longer game. Maybe he understood that destroying Rome would unite the entire Christian world against him. Maybe keeping Rome terrified but intact was more useful than reducing it to ashes. We'll never know why Attila turned back from Rome. Divine intervention, a moment of mercy, or simple calculation. But he withdrew, and Rome was spared. He never returned to Italy. 1 year later, he was dead. In 453 AD, at 47, Attila married a young woman named Ildico. The wedding feast was extravagant. He ate and drank heavily before retiring with his new bride. By morning, he still hadn't emerged. His attendants broke down the door and found him dead in a pool of blood, Ildico sobbing in the corner. The official cause, a massive nosebleed. Too drunk to wake, he'd choked in his sleep. The terror of empires, the scourge of Rome killed by a hemorrhage. Murder theories persist, but nothing was ever proven. His warriors were shattered. Jordanes writes, they slashed their own faces so that the greatest of warriors be mourned not with tears, but with blood. Attila was buried in a triple coffin, gold, silver, iron, then hidden in a secret grave, possibly beneath a diverted river. The slaves who dug it were executed. His tomb has never been found. His death ended the Hunnic Empire. His sons tried to divide power, sparking rebellions. Within a year, the empire collapsed. The Huns vanished into other tribes. Yet Attila's legacy endured. He weakened Rome with every raid, every ransom, every humiliation. When the Western Roman Empire fell in for 76 AD, the Huns were long gone, but their shadow remained. Attila had perfected psychological warfare, the weaponization of fear. 15 centuries later, his name still means devastation. His empire disappeared, his grave is lost, but the terror he created survives, a reminder of civilization's fragility. Rome believed itself eternal. Then a man from the steppes proved nothing is permanent. For one brutal decade, the earth shook under his hoofbeats. The world never forgot.